The paper I'm going to present here is a part of a quite large research project I've been into for quite long, which focuses on the international monetary system before the demise of the of international bimetallism, so the period before 1870. And this is a very large project which tries to assess various aspects of the structure of international monetary system. It starts from the idea that notwithstanding the fact that mainstream monetary historians depict the 19th century as a manifest destiny toward gold, this is very much in contrast with primary sources and what coeval commentators say. So, for example, it is a quotation from Beirut, who says that before 1870 you had two international settling houses in Europe, London and Paris, and it is the Franco-Prussian War which disrupts the role of Paris and the international financial system. So in order to do this, I gather new databases on exchange rates, interest rates, both market and central bank interest rates, and bullion prices for the pre-gold standard era. And I focus on 5 top European financial centers, and I am obliged to stress that they are European because for that time, if you look, for example, at exchange rates and so on and so forth, you don't have data for intercontinental transactions. So, for example, in London you have the exchange rate on New York, which starts to be quoted on a regular basis very late. So for this period, the international monetary system is still mostly an European monetary system with some connection, but we are very different. I mean, of course, there are a lot of connection with other continents, but they are very different in the structure from what they are on the continental basis. Just to give you an idea, this is a picture of the geography of the international monetary system. This is more focused on the early 1850s, and you see that it's very different from what it is now. So you have 6 main monetary areas. You have the franc area, the sterling area, the Dutch florin area. Then you have the southern German area, the Prussian thaler area, and the Hamburg mark area. And you have, of course, the Austrian Empire, which is something of its own. So this project goes, okay, I will spare you, this was just an overview of the results, of the general results of the project. I look at price integration, I reconstruct for the first time market interest rates during this period. I look at what are the effective parts we should look at when we compare exchange rates, because not all bullion markets are effective on all countries. So for example, you don't have a gold market in Frankfurt, so when you compute the parities and exchange rate with Frankfurt, you just have to base on silver and not on gold, because this is not an active parity. So I reconstruct all of this, and I also try to have a measure of what is the I would say the market expectation about future exchange rates. And this is very interesting because what you see from this kind of reconstruction, I can go into details if you are interested into this, is that in the early 1850s, you see that the market expects that currencies that are on silver will appreciate. And this is quite reversed in the 1860s. So there is something that must have to do with what we referred to this morning on the rush to silver or rush to gold in this period, which eventually ends with the demise of bimetallism. But for the sake of this presentation, I just want to focus on the question of bullion markets, and more precisely on 2 questions. The first one is that are ingot markets and bullion specie markets the same things, or are must we be careful when we deal with them? And the second one is a new high-frequency database on Boolean flows that I collected through a new source. So for the first question, I mean, when you look at medieval and early modern financial centers, you are struck by the fact that it's quite rare to have ingot prices. You have a lot of specie prices quoted in financial centers, but almost never ingot prices before the 18th century. So, I mean, people that have been studying medieval monetary question, for example, have often taken ingot and specie as perfect substitutes. But is this really correct? And I guess that this was a very useful period because this is a transition period where you have both ingot and specie prices quoted, so you can play a little bit with two and so on check. So in theory, there is no problem, and no great problem in taking them as substitute, because in theory, I mean, this is the difference, the percentage difference of the price of a coin with respect to the same content of bullion in ingot. Okay, so in theory there should not be much problem because you would expect that the price of the ingot would not fluctuate below a certain given corridor, which is given by a melting point, which means that if the price of this species goes below this point plus a transaction count, then it will be melted, so it cannot go too low on this point. And on the upper bound, you would expect that as the price rises, then it will be convenient to go to the mint and minting this kind of species, so you will have more supply, and then you will not have any big deviation of the two. Now the problem is that if you look at specie prices, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So for example, here you have a very special species, as you know, this is the Mexican dollar in the 1860s, and you see that you have an appreciation of up to 10% of the specie price with respect to the bullion price, which is very strange. So how can we justify this? This is a lot. So this one of the Mexican silver dollar is the first anomaly I observed. And here is another picture. Here you see the price. The one in blue is the price of ingots, and the one in red is the price of the Mexican dollar. And you see that these are prices in London, these are prices in Paris, and you see they are very much consistent. So it is not something that is related to a single market. So there's something strange going on there. So why is this the case? The case is that the reason is that, as we already hinted, that the Mexican dollar was traded at a premium with respect to ingots in China, because Chinese merchants really very much appreciated the certification effect given by Mexican mints. So this was an indispensable instrument for people who had to settle imbalances in trade with the Far East. But the problem is that in case you have higher demand in the Far East, as it is the case in the early 1860s, this cannot be immediately matched with new supply, which is quite logical because this species had to be minted in Mexico, then shipped to Europe, and then reshipped to the Far East, which takes a lot of months, the whole procedure. And this is a very big problem for people involved in the trade with the Far East in the 1860s. And you also see that people try to find alternative solutions. They try to accustom Chinese merchants to other silver pieces, like for example, they try with the French écu, but they really don't manage to find a really substitute because there's a long tradition for this for the circulation of this coin in China. And so the reason for this is very simple. I mean, the justification for this is that you have asymmetrical transaction costs, so you have a much higher transaction cost because you have a lot of time before having this coin minted in Mexico, and this allows for this big fluctuation. So, I mean, this is strange a priori, but I mean, from an economic point of view, this is quite easy to understand. There's also another strange anomaly in coin markets in this period, and it is the case of the Spanish gold doubloon. These are the prices of different kind of gold in Paris throughout the period. This is the red one is the ingot price, this one. Then you have other kind of species, and then the green one is the Spanish doubloon. You see, this is very strange because it is quite throughout the period very much overvalued, except for two periods here around the 1848 crisis, where it really very much converges with the other prices, and then during this period in 64, 65. Well, this is very strange. How can we explain this? And in fact, if you look at the sources, we find that in Spain, gold coins were overvalued by legal price. So, and in fact, if we look at the bimetallic ratios throughout Europe at the time, we find that actually the bimetallic ratio in Spain is much higher than the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe has 1 to 15.5, and here we just have 1 to 16 and something. So how was this viable and sustainable in the long term? And in fact, the reason why this was possible and sustainable is that gold minting was a state monopoly. So you had rationing, basically, because the state was not overissuing this kind of mint, even if it was overvalued. So the supply of this coin was very limited. So as a result, the price of the gold doubloon was not given by his gold content, but for the silver content that could be exchanged against it. And this works as long as the states committed to keep gold convertible into that price of silver was credible. And actually, if we try to conceptualize this, we find that we don't have anymore any minting point, because you cannot mint this kind of coin. And the price you would fluctuate around is just the legal price in silver. You can exchange it. Okay, so you will have a small corridor around this legal price. But imagine that this legal price is not credible anymore because the state doesn't want anymore to convert this coin into an overvalued way. Then what would you observe is that the price would collapse around, his normal melting point. So it will go and it will realign to the price it would have had in case this legal price would not exist. And then if the state starts guaranteeing this exchange rate, then you would see it returning at its previous point. Okay? And in fact, this is actually what we observe, because here you see in blue, again, the price of the Spanish doubloon, and here what you see here is the exchange rate on Madrid in Paris. So what you see is that the two periods we observe when we have a realignment of the doubloon price to his actual content, they correspond to the period when you have a collapse of exchange rate on Madrid. These are times when you have harsh crisis in both cases in Spain, and so the credibility of the commitment of the states committed to exchange this gold coin against an overvalued amount of silver is not credible anymore. So that's why in this period you see a collapse, and then in other period you see it going again to its actual to its legal price. Okay, now I'd like to pass to the second part of this presentation and looking at intercontinental bullion flows. At this point, we have statistics on bullion flows, but they come from customer statistics mainly, and so the problem is they are not high frequency because they are basically only on an yearly basis. And the contribution I try to make here is that just to use a new high frequency source, which is the Pixie, Abel and Langley circular, which was published weekly in London, and which gives us data on arrivals and departures of bullion and specie on the London market. Okay, I don't claim to these numbers here to have any kind of completeness because there are some small holes in the series. So this is just take it very cautiously, but this is just to give you an idea of what is the structure of the intercontinental bullion market in seen from London. So for example, this is the silver ingot market, and we see that in general we have a lot of supply from Latin America, which is reshipped mainly to India, and very few trade in silver ingot with the Far East. Now, if we look at the silver dollar, we see a fairly different picture, because we see that, okay, the supply is always from Latin America, but then you have everything that is re-exported to the Far East and anything to India. So you have a very specialized, segmented trade flows. I mean, of course, there are other, I mean, this is not a world complete, okay, complete picture, because of course you also have other flows that goes directly, for example, from Latin America to the Far East. So this is just data for London, but I think this helps us understand what is the link between the European financial system and the intercontinental one. And then this is the picture for gold, and I mean, I was very much struck when I see this, because this is very different from what we have seen so far. We see that this is, we have much higher flows, so this is a much more liquid market than the silver market, and it has a very different structure because most of gold comes from North America to Europe. You have some relationship with Latin America, but some of it is export, because actually Latin America is a producing area, but then you have Brazil, which is on kind of gold standard, and sometimes you have fluxes that goes from London to Brazil that are tied to monetary reasons. And then you have, of course, a huge contribution of Oceania, where we have the Australian gold mines discovered in this period. But the most interesting thing is that you have very big actor playing on this market, which is the Bank of England. And actually, if you read this source, you understand that the Bank of England is acting in a very special way because it clears the market. So if you have a lot of arrivals, for example, in gold to London, and you are not going to re-export them, at least because the conditions are not so good, then it would be deposited heavily at the Bank of England. And by contrast, if you have a lot of needs for exports from the bank and no supplies, then people will take them from the Bank of England. So the Bank of England is a very important player in the world gold market. And to conclude, this is show us the highly frequency data. So on the top here, you see what is arriving to London, and here what is re-exported from London. And this is the silver ingot market. This is the period 64 to 68, and you see that you have fairly regular arrivals from Latin America. Then you have increasing arrivals from North America in the end of this period, when the Nevada mines are discovered. And then you have, on the other hand, you have a lot of exports to India, basically all to India, which stop in the second half of the 70s. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you look at what happens in 1971, you see a completely different picture. This is very interesting because you see that you still have Latin American arrivals, but not so many. You have a lot of North American arrivals. So we see that the impact of the Nevada mines is very heavy. And at the same time, this is very strange, but you have a lot of arrivals from Far East. Far East is exporting silver ingots to Europe. This is quite strange. And this is even more, in a sense, even more strange if you look at the other side of the coin, which is the dollar, the Mexican dollar market. We see that in the 60s, the picture is quite different from the other one because we have regular arrivals from Latin America to Europe and shipments to the Far East, as we saw before, and anything to India. But then if we go and look at what's happening in 1871, we still see that the supply of silver is concentrating from the North America. So North America is exporting more and more silver to Europe. And then at the same time, you see that people is exporting Mexican dollar to the Far East. So this is very strange because I never had any evidence on this from qualitative sources, but apparently for some periods, China was acting in a very strange way because it was importing a lot of Mexican dollars for its own circulation and at the same time exporting a lot of silver, what was called the CC silver, which was the pure ingot silver in China. And then to conclude, this is the picture for the gold market, and we see that the picture is very, very different. We have fairly regular arrival, for example, from Oceania, which means that this is really a producing country because we see regular arrival. So it's just the output of mine which is shipped irrespective of market conditions. Stop. And just one last thing. This is North America, and this is the Overland-Gurney crisis. And what you see is that even though you have regular arrivals from North America, you also have a very huge sensitivities of North American flows to monetary condition, because this is mostly entirely driven by the crisis, so the fact that you have high interest rates in London, and they all go there. And if you look at what's going on in 71, you see here as well that you have a very important role of North America, and the Bank of England on the other side is regularly absorbing the extra supply and remitting this extra supply when it is needed by the market. So my conclusion that the bullion market was much more segmented than we commonly think, so we should pay a lot of attention when dealing with this thing, that there is a structural break in international bullion trade before and after 1817, and I think that this plays a very important role in building expectation and in what we were talking about this morning on people that were discussing monetary things at International Commission. And then you have a crucial role of the Bank of England in the world gold market, which should be investigated further. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to comment later, but I would like to give us the specified information, more Mexican dollars. I'm not surprised to hear the 10% premium or the gap. But I would like to know, you say 80-60s, particularly 10% premium. So you give me precisely from which year to which year, and then how much the Mexican dollar exported to the Far East. Mm-hmm. You showed the two data, the ratio and the quantity. So
So for the dates, you see you have a little bit in 1854, but the two biggest waves are 59 to 60, and then the biggest one is 62 to 62 to 64. 62 to 64. Okay. Yeah. So it's when you have the typing revolt and so on and so forth. You have a lot of turmoil, and concerning quantity, I mean the timing here is just it's different, because the problem with the source I have is that it's not complete because it's very rare to find. So the period from 64 to mid 68, you have 2.6 million. This is million pounds, British pounds, exported from, which is, I mean, it's not terrible. I guess in in the previous period it was much. And actually here, this is the very last period of the appreciation. Yeah. Yeah, 64. But yeah, it decreases after. But if you're interested in that, I can find yearly data on this. We have yearly data on the exports, so I can tell you. Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering up to what point it has a bit to do with what Kuroda mentioned, the years of the 1860s, 64 around.
Mm-hmm.
The Franco-Mexican War started then when Maximilian of Habsburg went to Mexico, and then there was a French invasion, etc. So the mining sector may have been affected, and would that have created speculation maybe, and that's why the metals flew out into Asia for speculative reasons, or what?
No, I think the demand from Asia is demand driven, not supply driven. What you say is very correct from the point of view of the mismatch from supply, and there is actually a shortage on supply, which is surely tied to the Mexican
Franco-Mexican
adventure
War.
of Napoleon III. And I also suspect that we can relate the fact that there was this problem on the silver market with the reason why Napoleon III went so
exactly
deep into
Mexico.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. But also you showed another graph in which the value, your blue line, which is the value of the silver coins, dropped below below melting point. The reason why they drop below melting point is because of the costs that would imply to turn them into ingots again, or what's the explanation for that level of below the melting point?
I think this is the pure melting point. This is when the price of the two of melting equals the difference between the two, and then I add the transaction cost, which can be tried to transport and so on and so forth. Freight,
and melting
insurance
again.
Lost.
And the actual melting and turning it to another form of bar or coin or whatever.
Because if you do it here, it is the very same price.
Yeah.
So you still have to add the prices of transporting, loss of interest, and so it only becomes profitable when the transaction cost is taken into account.
Thank you.
On your last slide, you also made the connection in some sense, to the transition of the monetary system. And when I read the sources of the late 1860s, I sometimes get the feeling people expect silver to become inflationary, but it's not a clear-cut sentiment. What is your take on that, either from the quantitative evidence or from the qualitative evidence available to you?
Concerning the quantitative evidence, I have two kind of dimensions. One is this kind of risk premium, which I computed, and I can give you the details if you want. And if you look at this, you see that pure silver currencies, like the Dutch florin, for example, they tend to be undervalued with respect to the uncovered interest rate parity in the 1860s. And this was very much the contrary in the early 50s. And I really think that there you have a sentiment about future appreciation and depreciation of silver. That's why, for example, it's very interesting. Hamburg, which has a currency which is pegged to silver, but it is you don't have it is not a unit of account which is directly pegged to a single coin. So this means that you can exchange in Hamburg the parity, the peg you have to silver at any time. And actually in 1868 they revalue, which means that they really see that the price of silver is going down, and they try to revalue the currency. By contrast, the Dutch can do the same, because they have a system where the unit of account is pegged to a physical coin, and so they have to remint everything, and it's what they do after 1871 actually. So there is a sentiment. And then I add to this the question of the structural break we can observe on the arrivals and departures on the bullion markets, which is I really think that what's going on there is playing a role in the expectation of people. People really expect that silver will go down because of the Nevada discovery.
Okay, so you are then. Oh, I see. That's very good to know. Thank you.
Stefano, only three simple questions. The first one, I'm very interested in what are the data from price of silver in London and Paris and gold. Do you
From the stock
work
exchange bulletin.
Boyer Chambaud? No.
No,
Boyer-Chambaud,
it's directly
Another
from the stock exchange bulletin.
From the stock exchange,
Yeah.
yes. So it is one point because it's very important for me also. When you told us that Far East exports silver dollar to UK, and you think that is strange because there are so these silver dollars in the two directions. Do you think this is arbitrage or trade? Because I explain you, in Portugal in the beginning of the 19th century, we have also gold, in this case gold, in two directions. Bullion from Brazil to Lisbon and Lisbon from Brazil.
Yeah.
Do you think is arbitrage or trade?
No, I really think it's arbitrage in the sense that, I mean, if we assume that the quantity are the same, which is, I mean, more or less the case, because what is imported in Europe in ingot, it is more or less
same.
exported from. I mean, if you take this to be the same quantity, I mean, this must be arbitrage because you must have a very different price for the two in the Far East, and then I mean, it's still profitable to import dollar, but they are in equilibrium, so they re-export, they remelt it, and they re-export the silver content to the west. So this is arbitrage.
Arbitrage. Third point, only to, it's not a question, but a point to join the presentations, because in Portugal, like Spain, we have we have a legal ratio higher than the other countries of Europe, and not the legal French ratio 1 to 15.5. So this is the same, more or less, not the same story, but more or less the same reasons for the overvaluation of gold.
And actually, in the 1840s, when I began collecting data for this, I also collected data for the Portuguese gold coin, which was also traded in London and Paris. Yes. But then the series is discontinued, so apparently it was not so liquid as the Spanish took bloom. So that's why you don't see it there. But in the 1840s, it was quite fairly regularly quoted in London and Paris as well.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's also.